Welcome to my second video in my series covering all things 1911 triggers and ignition systems. Yes, it's a silly title, but we're going to cover a lot. In this video, you'll learn what the perfect trigger pull feels like, what options exist to achieve that perfect trigger pull, what options exist to achieve a near perfect trigger pull, what are the pros and cons of each option, which of the two most popular sear jigs is a better value, and which option, if any, is right for you. So what is the perfect trigger pull? Well, the generally accepted definition includes the following characteristics. The break should be super crisp, like a glass rod breaking. It should be clean and not muddy. I have encountered trigger breaks that had no perceivable creep, but just felt dirty. The break should be consistent every time, which is kind of the definition of consistent, and it should feel lighter than what the scale says. So a 4-pound should really feel more like a 3. And the last one I threw in myself, which is 2 to 6 pounds. The fact of the matter is that anything below 2 pounds, it's going to be a rolling break. It's not going to be super crisp. And if you're setting your triggers for 6 pounds or more, you really need to rethink your life's choices. Now, someone complained to me about using the glass rod analogy for describing the perfect trigger break, saying that people can't relate to the idea. To bring the concept home, follow me to my test lab, aka my kitchen. For those who are imaginationally challenged, here's a glass rod. Next to it is a carrot, which provides a contrast and represents a not so great trigger pull. I'll start with my veggies. Note how once I exert force on the carrot, it bends quite a bit before ultimately breaking. This one bends quite a lot, last time I buy organic for this sort of thing. This is the same as a low quality trigger pull, with the trigger creeping rearward until it eventually breaks. On the other hand, you can see once I take up the slack in the glass rod, it doesn't yield any further. Only when I exert sufficient force to reach its breaking point does it move. For reasons I highlighted in my first video, a mass production gun can't achieve this perfection. Some are further away from perfection than others. So this is geared to those who tune their trigger after watching video 1, but still want something better. What options exist to take things to that next level? In order of complexity and skill required, first you can send your gun to a gunsmith, let them do all the work. Doesn't get much easier than that. Or you can buy components or kits that have already been prepped so that all you need to do is install them. Finally, you can learn to do your own trigger jobs. It's really not that difficult, but it can be daunting. Going in blind is never fun, and mistakes can be costly. Before I begin, I think it'll be helpful if I define 2 terms I'll be using. To illustrate, I've broken out the gray cartoon I used in video 1. Looking at the sear nose, you can see it has 2 cuts on it. The one highlighted in red is the primary. The angle at which is cut largely determines the trigger job's quality and safety. The one highlighted in yellow is the secondary, aka relief cut or escape cut. The escape cut is necessary for the primary to rotate out of the way of the hammer hooks without banging into them at the bottom. It also has the benefit of decreasing creep, and I'll get into this more in my next video. With all of that out of the way, let's finally dig into the meat of this video. Because the first 2 options are fairly self-explanatory, I'm going to circle back to them at the end of the video and dig into doing your own trigger jobs. And to do your own trigger jobs, you'll need some sort of sear jig to properly cut your primary. There are several dedicated to 1911s on the market, so how do you wade through all of those options? The least expensive is the Brownell's jig, which is $42. I know a bunch of people who use the Brownell's jig with great success. In function, it's identical to the Ed Brown jig, but it doesn't appear as sturdy as the Brown. The 2 most popular are the Ed Brown and the True Radius because of their price points and user friendliness. The Power Custom and Marvel Precision jigs not only carry higher price tags, but they're geared more toward the experienced user, meaning you set your own sear angle versus having it preset from the factory. The Yavapai jig hasn't been on the market that long, and I don't know anyone who's tried one, which makes it an unknown quantity. Correction, I do know someone who bought it for its magnifier, which is pretty kick-ass. However, when I pinged them on how they liked the sear jig portion, he admitted he didn't even notice it had one until I asked. I left it on this list because I like saying Yavapai. Yavapai. For this video, I'll stick with the 2 popular ones, starting with the Ed Brown. To use it, you place your sear in the jig thusly. Place the provided 20 thousandths shim on the deck, and then slide your India stone across it, shaping the primary. The secondary is done freehand, and having a shim stack helps to maintain an even cut. What I like about the Ed Brown is its flexibility. I've become a big fan of having my primary surface evenly engage both hammer hooks. You can get a really good trigger pull engaging only one hammer hook, and I've done it, but I'm type A and I want perfection. In my mind, a lasting super crisp trigger pull is easier to attain with both hammer hooks being engaged. It's kind of basic physics. Are you better off having the force of the sear nose spread across 2 points or 1? Anyway, the brown jig allows me to cut my sear so that I do get engagement on both hammer hooks. Even if my hammer hooks are a bit wonky or the hammer and sear pinholes in the gun aren't cut parallel, something Colt's known for. I simply favor one side or the other to compensate as I'm stoning my sear. You can change the angle on the jig by using this bolt, but it's not really a great idea because it isn't marked, so if you change it and want to return it to the factory settings, it's difficult to tell exactly where your starting point was. Also, there's no locking feature to keep the screw in place once you move it, so you're relying on Loctite. That being said, I can slightly modify my angle by changing the shim location. I can change it even more by using a long sear instead of the standard length one. The thought process behind the true radius is that since your sear nose rotates in an arc during the firing cycle, the primary should be cut to that same radius, providing a consistent optimum angle to the hammer hooks. The TR jig consists of 2 hardened steel discs positioned by sear pins. Those discs are divided into 4 segments, each with a different corresponding radius. You place your sear between the 2 discs and clamp it into a sturdy vise. The primary is cut by stoning along the circumference of the jig in a radial motion as shown until the sear nose is flush, followed by running a polishing stone over the surface in the same manner. Once your primary is cut, you reset your sear orientation in the jig to cut your secondary. There's no option to change the primary angle, and you must use long sears from either EGW or Harrison in the jig. I bought my true radius jig about 8 months ago to experiment with. I had decided to do a trigger job on one of my guns, so I pressed it into immediate service. I got to work clamping the jig into the center of my bench vise, then carefully stoned the sear per the instructions. Once I was satisfied I'd done a good job, I applied die chem to the primary and stuck it in the gun to check hammer hook engagement. The results told me that one side was higher than the other. Thinking I missed something, I put the sear back in the exact location in the jig, the exact location in the bench vise, only to find that the high side was sitting sub-flush from the jig and the low side was sitting proud from it. So I rotated the sear to the next shortest radius and stoned it again, followed by another hammer hook check. Sure enough, one or the other side was high again. Back into the jig for more stoning, and on it went through the progressively smaller radii until the sear had been cut too short to be serviceable. I went through 2 sears in this manner. There was at least one instance where I moved the sear to the next smallest radius and both sides were sub-flush. There's really no other way to say it. Repeatability on the true radius jig sucks. I feel bad saying this because I really like and respect John Harrison. He's a good guy and he makes really good stuff. On the other end of the spectrum is Wilson Combat. Sorry if I'm about to launch into a tangent, but I'm pretty amazed at the shitty attitude they threw my way this week. I'm including a bit of a buyer's guide as part of my next video, how to do your first trigger job. To flesh that out, I've been asking various component vendors to share what level they prep their hammer hooks to. This is an absolutely appropriate question, and everyone except Wilson Combat responded with the info I was seeking. Hell, John Harrison answered me on a Sunday night. Some chucklehead from Wilson Combat named Jim, on the other hand, responded, and I quote, "We don't share that information. These are our hammers," end quote. Then closed the ticket, preventing me from calling him an asshat. Clarifying my question. Again, this is not proprietary secret information. I'm going to find out when I look at the damn thing. So just tell me up front and save me the time of buying the wrong part. The cherry on top of this was the "How satisfied were you with the support?" follow-up email where I expressed the service was far from adequate. Specifically about that no one has followed up. I've been buying from Wilson Combat since the 90s. I've spent a fair chunk of change over the last 30 years with them. However, they made it clear they don't want my business. It's probably a safe bet they don't want yours either. Apologies for the rant, but that sort of attitude really pisses me off in this industry, where the standard is a lot higher. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, lack of repeatability. So this likely stems from the way the 2 discs can move around, only being positioned by a pair of kind of undersized sear pins, or the holes are oversized a little bit. You pick it. I tried to tighten it up by using a pair of EGW sear pins, which were oversized by a thou, and that really didn't make a noticeable difference. When I did finally get a sear that gave me engagement on both hooks, I cut a secondary, threw in the gun, and it felt like crap. After spending an entire afternoon trashing 2 sears through no fault of my own, it's not hard to imagine what I did with everything. I said screw it, called it a few names, and threw it in my box of shame. That would be the end of the story, except a few folks insisted the TR could yield a crisp pull. So a few weekends ago, it was rainy and I was kind of bored, so I pulled it out for another go. I started by enlarging the secondary cut, cleaning things up, and then I threw it in my Dan Wesson Valor Commander. After cycling it a few times, a good amount of creep came back. So it got even more secondary, which yielded the same results. I'll explain why I got what I got later in this video. Doing your own trigger jobs involves not just the jig, but the supplies and tools that go with it. Granted, I've accumulated a lot of specialty tools, but this is what I pull out every time I do one. Not including general gunsmith's tools or a jig, you'll spend about $130 for what you need to get started on your first trigger job. Now that we've covered the sear jigs, let's circle back and discuss the various options in more detail. For each one, I'll talk about the pros, the cons, the cost, and the amount of time involved to cut the sear. Finally, I'll rate each option's max potential on a scale of 1 to 10. For reference, most mass-produced 1911s fall somewhere between a 4 and a 6. Dan Wessons are kind of their own animal. They're usually at least a 7.5. Just as before, we'll start with the gunsmith. The pros here are obvious. You send your gun off and it comes back with the perfect trigger pull. About the only effort required here is shipping your gun. As for cons, $175 can be a bit salty for some, and if you have more than one gun to take care of, well, that total cost can really balloon. That $175 is an average across solid gunsmiths, and as you can see, it doesn't include parts. And there will be parts because most solid gunsmiths won't stone MIM. I'm not a gunsmith, much less a solid one, and I won't stone MIM. For what it's worth, $175 is still higher than the upfront cost to start doing your own trigger jobs, not including the jig or shipping and handling. The cost of failure here can be extremely high. There are way too many dudes, and I guess a few women out there, who call themselves gunsmiths but have no business doing so. I've heard and read accounts from people getting their guns back with the triggers being worse than when they sent the gun, and in some instances, the frame's been hogged out. There is no world in which you need to modify a 1911's frame to do a trigger job. So if you choose this route, make sure you do your research and go with a highly recommended smith who's got a solid reputation for working on 1911s. Not a guy who has a solid reputation for building perfect over-under shotguns. Once you find that smith, though, you're likely looking at a 6 to 8 month waiting period or more to get your gun back. And that's predicated on the smith actually taking on new work. A lot of them aren't right now, and they have their books closed. Your easiest DIY option is to install a true radius sear. It's ready to use out of the bag, and it's going to be more consistent than what you get off of a jig. I know for a fact that John Harrison isn't sitting around stoning sears on his jigs all day. To support OEMs like Dan Wesson, Alchemy, and a few others, these things are cranked out by the thousands in an automated environment. The price, it's $50. It's only $20 more than an uncut sear. I may have planted the seed in John Harrison's mind that the market would bear $60 for this sear. Sorry, I'm a marketing consultant. Sometimes I can't turn it off. The cons, lack of flexibility, so you can't adjust based on your individual gun. Also, they're not always drop-in, and this applies mostly to the thumb safety. However, these are big sears, so you almost certainly won't have to replace your thumb safety. Just a little modification. I'll lump that last con together with the best trigger quality number. If you recall from my previous video, a really good trigger pull relies on both the sear and the hammer to be properly configured and prepped. So you can have a perfectly cut sear, but if your hammer hooks are the height of the White Cliffs of Dover and covered in a high friction material like flat Cerakote, you can't expect to have an amazing trigger pull. Mass-produced guns are all over the map in this respect. That's why this option has a large range and tops out at 8. Your other sort of prefab option is going with the full ignition kit. Once again, they're ready to use right out of the bag, and they're price competitive. If you purchased all of the items in the ignition kit separately, and they'd be unprepped versus buying the kit, you're talking a difference of plus maybe 10% of that. So you essentially buy the parts and get the prep for free. As you can see, looking at the Harrison and the EGW, different kits come with different parts. Now you may think there's a lot of parts in that EGW kit, but I tell you what, when I do a trigger job, I'm going to change out the sear because I'm going to cut a new one. I'm going to install a new hammer because I don't stone MIM. I'm going to swap out my mainspring for a 17-pounder every time, and I'm going to put an Allen sear spring in the gun. The disco, it's kind of optional, but I replace it anyway. As for best possible outcome, the only one that I have firsthand experience with is the one that Brazos Custom makes. And that was really, really good. That was probably an 8.5. However, people I trust and respect have given high marks to the one that comes from Cylinder and Slide, and obviously the EGW and the Harrison. Speaking of the Harrison, let's talk about that 9 with an asterisk, because it refers to a Harrison equivalent that I modified. As I mentioned, the Valor Commander I was working on came with a True Radius sear, as did my other Dan Wessons, my Valor and my Guardian. They were all excellent out of the box, and I still haven't touched the ignition system on my Guardian. It's that good. As for the Valor Commander, I installed an Allen hammer in it, polishing the hooks to a mirror finish, because ring hammer. Then I increased the secondary cut on the sear, which is where the 30 minutes came from. I essentially have a Harrison ignition kit, except for that slightly modified sear. The result was a trigger pull that was practically free of creep. At the time, there was no way I could have done better myself. Unfortunately, when you finally do figure out how to get a perfect trigger pull, that 9 doesn't quite cut it anymore, particularly when you've already done all your other guns. And yes, for the record, I do recognize my compulsion as a creep hunter, and I remain blissfully untreated for it. So that's where the 9 comes from. Downside, same as just replacing the sear. No flexibility, and they're not always drop-in. With the ignition kit, you need to make sure your grip safety and your new hammer get along. They don't always. Moving on to the sear jigs for doing your own trigger jobs. There is one caveat on the best possible trigger pull rating. Just like a pre-cut sear, one you cut yourself won't yield best results without doing a complete trigger job. This means replacing or properly prepping the rest of the parts in the ignition group, just like if you bought one of the more complete ignition kits like an EGW. That best possible trigger pull number, that's going to reflect the results you'll get as part of a complete trigger job, not to be confused with being part of a complete and balanced breakfast. Alright, let's start with the Ed Brown sear jig. Pros, it's $50. That is one of the least expensive options here. Flexibility, I already talked about. Downside, it's easier to get completely wrong, and that really applies only if you're using a long sear in it. With the standard length sear, there's not much to stone away, so you can only go so wrong. Time, 30 minutes to 2 hours. Again, it kind of depends what you're doing. If you're carefully stoning a standard length sear, that's your 30 minutes. However, if you're stoning a long sear and you're doing all the hammer hook checks like I do, yeah, you can spend 2 hours. But at the end, that best trigger quality, it's a 10 out of 10. Moving on to the True Radius jig, it's pretty easy to use, and you can only screw up so badly with it. Downside, it's expensive. I can buy an Ed Brown jig and 2 sears to throw away as practice for less than what the True Radius jig costs. I talked about repeatability and flexibility. Also, it requires a sturdy vise. In my opinion, it really needs a bench vise. And not everybody has a sturdy vise. Not everybody has a bench. Time to cut a sear, 30 to 45 minutes. Again, sear only. Before I dive into that 7.5 number, I want to stop and cover the double asterisk comment at the bottom that also appeared on the Ed Brown sear jig page. To get a really good trigger pull, your secondary cut has to be perfectly square with your sear. Cutting to this precision requires skill and patience to stone your cut evenly side to side. Neither jig will do this for you. Sure, you can set up your TR to help guide your secondary cut, but I found that it's actually harder to stone your surface evenly using that arrangement. In short, it's a skill you'll need to learn when you do your own trigger jobs. It's not super hard, even for an idiot like me who can't stone anything evenly. I just go slowly and make a lot of checks. All right, let's talk about that 7.5. The number is what it is, and that's how it felt. But why? Let's take a look at some pictures and see if we can figure that out. On the left is a close-up of the pre-cut TR sear from my Dan Wesson. As I mentioned, it has a slightly larger secondary versus how it came from the factory. On the right is a sear cut on the TR jig. The hammer is the same, it's an Allen Speed Demon, and I've been using those on everything lately. There are 2 significant differences you should notice between these sears. First, the angles at which the primaries engage the hammer hooks aren't the same. This difference will have an impact on trigger quality, good or bad. Because the primaries are cut in a radius, I'm kind of referring to these as an average angle. Second, take a look at the respective transitions between the primary and secondary surfaces. Even though I cut on it, the pre-cut, lots of cuts, has a much gentler transition, whereas the one cut on the jig is much more abrupt. It's going to require more force to overcome that obstacle versus the smooth radius on the pre-cut sear. Now, I always stone a very small radius between those 2 surfaces when I cut my sear, and this one was no different, so it's there. The next one shows where I increased the secondary cut in the hopes of settling the sear nose into the hooks a bit more. But all it did was decrease engagement and make it feel like that hammer would drop on its own at any moment. Also, I recut the primary on this sear just to make sure I wasn't basing my assessment on a single data point. Both were identical. Could I get a better outcome if I massaged that transition a bit more? Maybe. But why would I when I can buy the one on the left for only $20 more than the one that I have to perform major surgery on? That seems like a no-brainer to me. We've come to the point where you kind of decide which option is right for you. And in order to do that, you need to ask yourself a few questions. First of all, how many triggers do you honestly expect to upgrade? 1, 5, 3, what? Do you want to learn how to do trigger jobs? It's okay if you don't. There's no wrong answer here. What do you want your triggers to feel like? Do you want perfection? Are you willing to accept some creep in exchange for a little bit less effort? That sort of thing. And what's your spending threshold? I'll share my own journey on this one. When I decided I wanted to learn how to do trigger jobs, that was it. I wanted to learn how to do trigger jobs. I only had one gun to do, but at that time, what happened between the hammer hooks and the sear nose, it was like some sort of black art to me, and I wanted to master it. So I bought my Ed Brown jig, and my first couple of trigger jobs were pretty good. And then I went through a rough patch. But eventually it all sort of crystallized, and I feel almost like a master of the dark art. That's giving myself a bit more credit than I deserve, but I'm glad I made the journey. In order to kind of condense everything into some manageable buckets, here are some thoughts. Which option if you want perfection? Either take it to a gunsmith or buy an Ed Brown jig. Lowest effort? Again, gunsmith. Or buy an ignition kit. Lowest cost? Pre-cut TR sear. Just buy one of those and install it. The best jig? I think it's obvious which of the two gets my nod. Finally, I'll throw one other option at you, which I call best bang for the buck. And that's to buy a pre-cut TR sear and a hammer from John Harrison. You save yourself some money and you still get an awesome trigger pull. And that's about it. So I hope you've enjoyed both of the videos I've done so far. And if you do buy an Ed Brown jig with the intent of doing your own trigger jobs, stay tuned for video number 3 where I will walk you through how to do your very first trigger job. That one's almost done and I'm looking forward to finishing it because my Valor Commander's been sitting on my bench disassembled for the last 2 months while I make these videos. The sacrifices I make. Anyway, thanks again for watching.